Hello and welcome again to the Bylund Clinic Podcast. Episode number 4 here. Starting to get a little used to talking to the camera. So in the last episode, spent some time really talking about what a specific learning disability is, right? This sort of unexpected underachievement in reading, writing, or math. And then we kind of did a bit of a deep dive into dyslexia, which is a type of learning disorder. So an unexpected underachievement in reading, specifically word reading, fluency, and spelling. And we did a few other things. So if you haven't listened to that podcast yet, you might want to go back and listen to it. We're going to kind of build off of that podcast in this discussion today. So some of the other things we talked about is just sort of generally, right? Like how is a learning disorder determined? And we talked about that unexpected underachievement being unexpected given the child's age and their intellectual ability and their educational history, and that underachievement has to be statistically significant. We also talked about sort of core conceptual abilities. So when we're looking at a child's development in reading, writing, or math, we can compare it to other kids their age. That's pretty straightforward. The other thing that we do clinically and in the schools is compare their development in reading, writing, or math to their conceptual abilities. And these conceptual abilities are kind of like these abstract things, right? And it's not always really clear when someone completes a psychoeducational evaluation, like what is it that we're even comparing this to? We sort of have this sort of general sense of intellectual ability, but the truth is there's no definition of what that thing even is. So, we talked about things like verbal ability, so a child's vocabulary and verbal reasoning, or visual spatial skills and their ability to kind of create images in their mind's eye and orient those images and see how different parts fit together to create something new. And we also talked about something that's called fluid reasoning, but essentially just your ability to perceive patterns in information, right? To see patterns that allow us to predict what might come next, right? Or kind of perceive patterns in information that allow us to then solve problems we haven't seen before, because we're kind of able to gather the evidence and sort of see how everything fits together. And also kind of generalized learning. So these are these sort of core areas of conceptual ability that we then compare development in reading, writing, or math to, right? And so we talked about that. Now, why am I doing this, right? So, I've talked about this in earlier podcasts, but my aim here is to hopefully provide some help for the just general population of people, namely parents of kids with learning differences, to understand what in the world is in these assessment reports that they receive. Because they don't make sense, right? They don't make sense to 99.9% of people. They include statistics that are foreign to people. They include a lot of different psychological constructs that are foreign to really everybody, right? Other than the psychologist at the table, and yet the psychologist presents all this information, and then at an IEP meeting, for example, and everyone's supposed to make a decision around the child's eligibility for services or what those services should look like, and the report doesn't make any darn sense, right? So trying to help out with that a bit. Now, besides the sort of foreign concepts or constructs, right, and all the statistics, another reason why they don't make a whole lot of sense is they're oftentimes written about the test, right? They're not even written about the child. So they give all these test descriptions and test scores and descriptions of the tests, the individual tests that were given, right? And then somehow people are supposed to extract some kind of meaning from that and sort of put all the pieces together and understand how we reached some conclusion. And it's just not a really effective way to write for the reader, So one of the things that we're doing here is kind of breaking it down based on different like constructs or different ideas, right? And seeing how all the pieces fit together. So we talked about dyslexia and what dyslexia is and the areas of processing related to dyslexia and how it's diagnosed and things like that. And now we're going to try to do the same thing for writing. So anyway, I should probably stop rambling on about all that stuff that we covered last time, right? But let's talk about specific learning disorders in the area of writing. Okay, now this is oftentimes referred to as dysgraphia, right? So we talked about dyslexia. It's reading disorder, learning disorder in the area of reading. Dysgraphia is a learning disorder in the area of writing. And usually what people are talking about when they talk about dysgraphia has to do with the motor aspect of writing, right? So handwriting is just completely illegible and really sort of outside of the continuum of what we would expect for a child that age. So that's what we oftentimes are referring to when we talk about dysgraphia, but that's not the only reason that reading or writing breaks down, right? So we spent a lot of time talking about dyslexia last time. Well, if you can't read the words, you're probably not able to spell them, and if you can't write the words, you can't write. And so some kids struggle with writing because of their dyslexia, right? That's just too big of a barrier for them when it comes to writing. And yet others, they've got okay sort of handwriting and their spelling is okay, and yet they still just really struggle to get the ideas from their mind onto paper. And we'll talk about that a bit. Usually that's related to some type of executive dysfunction, right, or impaired executive functioning abilities. And so we'll talk about what that is here in just a minute. Okay, so I guess we'll sort of just jump right in there, right? So let's start with the handwriting piece, right? So, gosh, it's so much bigger than just handwriting. So we'll talk about that in a sec. But from an assessment standpoint, usually in a psychoeducational evaluation, or maybe a child received an occupational therapy evaluation or a neuropsych assessment, they're going to look at their motor development, and they're going to look at things like their fine motor control, which are essentially tasks where kids are tracing stuff, right? There's others, but the big frequently given ones are basically tracing, or what they call visual motor integration, which is essentially the child's ability to integrate their visual perception, right? So are they perceiving forms accurately, and then their ability to copy it, and usually that's just copying different geometric shapes, and they get sort of increasing complexity. Now, oftentimes when kids struggle with fine motor control or visual motor integration, then it really impacts their development in terms of forming letters or forming numbers or lining up numbers on a page when they're doing math, right? Or their sizing and spacing and placement of letters on the page when they're writing. Now, personally, I'm not sure that goes far enough to just look at that, right? Because I've seen kids who have had adequate fine motor control and visual motor integration on these kind of novel tasks where they're copying shapes, but their handwriting is still terrible. And I've seen the opposite. I've seen kids with really bad fine motor control, and their handwriting might not be the best. It's not winning any awards, but it's all right, And so I really think it's important that we're also actually looking at handwriting. So we're actually looking at letter formation and sizing and spacing. And in addition to that, we're looking at, sequencing and copying speed and motor planning, required to write letters at the correct size and formation and spacing in order to fit in the allotted space. And so I think it's really important to take a look at those. Now, when we see kids that have deficits in these areas, and those deficits are widely outside of what we'd expect given their age and intellectual ability, a lot of times that's referred to as like a graphomotor dysgraphia, right? And so their fine motor control and handwriting is really impacting their ability to produce written language. Now, that's number one, right? So we've got this sort of graphomotor dysgraphia. Now, like I said before, some kids really struggle with writing because they struggle to spell. And I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here because we did talk about this quite a bit in the last podcast. So if you haven't heard that and this is of interest to you, I'd encourage you to listen to it. But we did discuss dyslexia and the areas of processing related to impaired reading ability. And the same areas of processing, the phonological processing, orthographic processing, rapid naming, will also impact spelling ability too, right? Now this last area in which writing starts to break down is when it comes to working memory and other executive functions. So sort of pause here for a moment and provide a little bit more information in terms of what those things are, right? Because now here I am, right, using all these different terms and constructs that just aren't familiar to most people, right? Because you don't You don't do this for a living. And so let's start there, right? So this idea of working memory, it's not my ability to retain information, right? It's essentially my ability to keep information active in my awareness, keep all the information that I need to perform a task active in my awareness in order to execute the task, right? So any sort of complex series of movements, right, is going to require working memory, because I've got to keep track of all of those things in my mind while I'm doing it. And so a real clear example of this for parents would be, you tell your child to go do 3 things and they do 1, right? Now through the lens of working memory, what's happened there is they've heard the 3 things, but they haven't kept it active in their awareness long enough in order to be able to do all of those things, right? So maybe they do the first thing or they do the last thing, and they generally forgot what it was that they were supposed to do, right? So that's working memory. Now that's one very key critical executive function, right? But there's others. So when we talk about executive functioning, we're also talking about our ability to regulate our attention, to think flexibly and be able to shift gears from one task to another. My ability to inhibit kind of impulsive or automatic reactions in order to regulate my attention and perform the task that I need to do, right, without getting distracted or off task or off track. Now, those are these sort of core sort of neurocognitive executive functions. But practically, right, like what does that mean? That means I'm able to focus my attention, and I'm able to filter out distractions, and I'm able to inhibit impulsive behaviors, and I'm also able to plan because of that. And those things also allow me to sort of organize tasks and activities. It allows me to self-monitor my work and make corrections as needed, and then allows me to really sort of stay on task and see things through to completion. All those are really important executive functions. Now, why is that so important for writing? Well, I would say most academic tasks, everything requires some degree of executive function, I suppose, unless they're overlearned automatic tasks that we don't think about, right? But anything that requires effort and focus is going to require executive functions. And I would say that probably I don't think that there's any academic task, just sort of speaking generally here, that requires more executive function than writing. I mean, just think about all the things we've talked about so far, right? So, all the different components of this task, it's really very complex. I mean, there's the motor aspect of it, right? So now if those skills are intact, then that becomes sort of automatic. You don't have to think about it. But for young writers, that's part of it, right? I've got to think about my letter formation and then spelling, right? I've got to make sure I'm spelling things correctly. But that's not it, right? I've got all the mechanics of writing, right? Like all the punctuations and capitalization and all of the grammatical rules I have to sort of be aware of and comply with as I'm writing. But even beyond that, right? Like even all of those sort of mechanical aspects of writing, I also have to plan what it is that I'm going to write. I have to be able to organize my ideas in a way that is going to make sense to the reader. I've got to sequence the events as I'm writing, and really as I'm doing that, I'm having to put myself in the shoes of the reader, right? I'm having to sort of imagine I'm the reader at that point, and be able to then provide sufficient, not just organization and sequencing, but sufficient details, right, to really be able to effectively communicate what it is that I want to say. And all of that requires tremendous executive functioning capacity. And so when we see kids struggle with executive functioning, oftentimes we see them struggling with their writing as well. And just another way in which kids can struggle. And what I hear most often from parents are these are the kids where they'll say, hey, he's a bright kid, he's got a lot of great ideas, he can talk to you about subjects at length, right? I mean, sometimes longer than we even wish for, but they can't get those ideas down on paper, right? And that's because in all likelihood they struggle with the executive functioning that's required in order to be able to organize all those thoughts and then communicate them in a very structured way. And so those are a number of different ways in which writing can start to break down, and then we have a child that may be presenting with a learning disorder in the area of writing. And so clearly, right, I mean, these are when we talked about reading, we talked about word reading, fluency, and spelling, and how that can break down into different areas of psychological processing. Here we have really sort of wide-reaching areas of cognitive processing, right? Everything from fine motor control to areas of language processing related to reading, to these executive functioning abilities. And we really want to know what it is that's getting in the way, because that's obviously going to really have a greatly influence what it is we're going to do to then be able to help the child out and help them learn more efficiently and perform better in school, right? And so the assessments have to not only just look at handwriting and spelling and writing fluency and written expression, but also look at these areas of processing that might help to explain why it is that they're having that trouble. So that's dysgraphia, right? Our specific learning disability in the area of writing. Now I feel compelled here to just sort of say again, this isn't diagnostic in any way. Obviously, if you have questions about your child, I don't know your child, and so I'm not making any sort of diagnosis here or specific recommendations. And broadly speaking, I do like to talk about special education regulations and laws, but of course I'm not an attorney, and so if you have specific questions about your child or their situation, whether it's their assessment or their treatment, or sort of how to navigate the special education system, I would just recommend contacting a professional who can help guide you with your specific case. Now, if you have questions about this podcast, about dysgraphia, or really any other related topic, I would love to hear them. I'd love to hear your questions. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future podcasts and other topics you'd like to hear me discuss. And you can do that by reaching out to me at info@drjamesbylund.com. That's info@drjamesbylund.com, or on social media. So I'm on Facebook and Instagram at the Bylund Clinic. Just learning how to navigate the social media stuff here. So I think I'm getting a little bit better at it, but never did it personally, right? So trying to figure it all out professionally here. But you can contact me there. Again, I would love to hear from you. And as always, I just really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to listen to this. I can genuinely say I'm forever grateful that you've taken a little bit of your time to listen to me talk about these subjects. Passionate about them. I love learning about these things and discussing them with people and ultimately being able to help out kids and families. And so thank you again. And again, don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Take care.